We are continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. Last time, in the introduction to the commentaries on Freud's Papers on Technique, Lacan introduced the notion of the ego as a problem for psychoanalysis, what he called the psychological human symptom par excellence on page 16. And yet Lacan did not spell out what notion of ego he himself is working with. Why, we might ask? What does Lacan mean by the word ego? In this chapter, Preliminary Comments on the Problem of Resistance, he uses the concept of resistance as an inroad to zero in on what he means by ego. Resistance, of course, is a psychological term describing a patient's direct or indirect rejection of the psychological solution posed in the clinical setting. In the therapeutic setting, resistance occurs at the moment the patient is on the brink of insight and seems to choose to want to be left in the dark about the solution to the problem. According to Lacan, on page 23, Freud's initial researches indicate that resistance is linked to the idea of the ego. When Freud writes about the rejection of insight through a patient's ideational mass, one realizes, Lacan says, that the notion of the ego is already present and already foreshadows for Freud all the problems that it now presents for us, Lacan says. Although Lacan hasn't said it outright yet, he is here hinting at the idea that the ego is nothing but a bundle of rejections and refusals of insight. It's the patient's refusal to know him or herself. Lacan says, too, that transference and countertransference are instances of the ego rising up to protect the human personality, and it's most evident in the case of a psychoanalyst's countertransference, which Lacan says also on page 23. Here. He says, quote, "It's nothing other than the function of the analyst ego," or going farther, on page 23, "It's nothing but the sum total of the analyst's prejudices." So, in other words, when the countertransference appears, this is the emergence of the analyst ego, and it represents a kind of resistance that is being played out from the analyst side. So, again, this is the idea of ego as resistance. Following Freud, the ego looks to be what the therapist discovers in the patient, a whole organization of certainties, beliefs, of coordinates, of references, which is what Freud from the beginning called an ideational system, and what Lacan seems to want to call the ego. The trouble with the ego in treatment, then, is that in the course of speaking with the patient, the psychoanalyst has trouble, just as the patient has trouble, accessing the deep, unconscious, motivating desires that so much of the surface-level speech has come to mask. Lacan thinks part of the goal of therapy is to get at, quote, that speech which is to be reconquered in the unconscious, since it's that part of the subject separated from his or her history. Lacan says on page 20, "The quest for truth is the quest for the truth of the subject." He continues, "Analysis is an experience of the particular, and as such, needs to get to the bottom of a particular person's desires. To that extent that it's impossible in the therapeutic process, the ego is a mask." Let's see what other insights we can uncover as we continue our study of this text. Thank you for listening.